evening, ladies and gentlemen, and first of all, our apologies. We knew there was interest in New France and Electric City. We didn't realize there was this much, which is a good thing, and as was announced earlier, I guess we're going to have another showing tomorrow afternoon at 12. So first of all, welcome to our presentation tonight. Do I need to use this mic, or is this?
Yes. No, yes.
My name is Ronald Ford, and I'm chairman of the Weymouth Waterfront Development Committee. And a lot of you know what the Waterfront Committee is, but I want to say a few words about it because we have a mandate and we try to stick to it. And I know there's some people from out of town, and we want you to understand who we are and what we're trying to do. First of all, on the agenda, we're going to start with a little music. We have here a gifted musician who's going to use a violin that's been has a New France connection, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then we'll have a presentation by Paul Stehelin. And near the end of the presentation, we're going to have a few draws for the book Electric City, donated by Paul Stehelin. And we also have some for sale. We've provided a donation box in the back. It's a free will offering, and you're welcome to do that or not, whatever suits you. Again, the Waterfront is a registered charitable organization. We've been founded since 1999, and our mandate is to develop and maintain the waterfront area on both sides of the Sissebu River, from the Trestle Bridge, which is gone now, to Gates's Lane for the benefit of the community at large, and to develop and maintain the cultural and heritage aspects of the village of Weymouth and surrounding area for the benefit of the community at large. And this is where tonight the second part of our mandate comes into effect. What have we done? I'll go through this quickly because I want to give you lots of time to ask questions with Paul and on his presentation. If you see any development in Weymouth, unfortunately, it's the Waterfront who has taken the initiative to develop it. There's Sissebu Place, Sissebu Landing, the floating dock, signage system for the village is all initiated by Weymouth Waterfront Development Committee. It's taken a few years, and we've got a few projects on the go as well, coming up. You might ask what we're planning for all this. We have a building in town, and we'd like to develop it into an interpretive center for New France. We'd like to have artifacts there, and eventually we'd like to provide guided tours to the original site itself. To do that, we would need to develop interpretive panels that would be at the site, and we would have to do some work on the road there. The property itself is owned by the Department of Natural Resources, and they have designated it as a park area, and we're not exactly sure what that means, but we're working closely with them, and they've assured us that they have a plan for that particular property. And when they're supposed to announce it, they were supposed to announce it this fall. They put it off till the spring, and we're on to them to try to work with them to develop that property. I think Hal mentioned about signing up for membership cards. I want to assure you that we're not doing this to solicit you for funds. We're doing it so that we can go to government and saying, hey, there are a lot of people in the area who have an interest in that property, and we want to be able to give them numbers as well as provide you with information as to what we're doing and maybe get your feedback as to what we should be doing. As I mentioned earlier, we're very fortunate to have with us an accomplished musician, Cristal Thibault, and she's going to be playing violin that has a New France connection. We initially wanted to bring a piano here, which was part of the New France settlement, but the logistics of it, tuning it, bringing it here, and bringing it back to the university, we opted out for the violin, and I'll just give you a short, brief session about the violin. It was given to the family of Edmund Comeau. Some of you know who Edmund Comeau was. He was a barber in Weymouth, and there were actually 2 violins given to that family for the boys that wanted to learn to play. One of them took it up quite seriously, the other one didn't. Anyway, this one here, this violin came from France before the Second World War. One of the boys became quite proficient with it. He took it when he enlisted in the Second World War and went overseas and played for his fellow soldiers, brought it back. And tonight we're fortunate to have Cristal Thibault, and she's going to play that for you. So, without further ado, I might say, you might ask yourself why we're having music. Well, New France was a place of business, a place of commerce, but from all stories and all legends, it was a place of amusement, it was a place of dance, it was a place of people coming for entertainment, and I'm sure there was a lot of music, so that's another connection. So without holding you up too long, I'll give you Cristal Thibault. She's going to play a couple of old numbers for you. Thank you. further delay, I'd like to introduce our special guest tonight, Paul Stehelin. He is the great-great-grandson of the original big fella, Emile Stehelin, the founder of New France. So I will give you Paul Stehelin.
Yeah, you're missing the name.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. I'm amazed. And I'm not running drops. Even though I'm wearing red, don't take that into account. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm flabbergasted that as many people as this would show up to listen to this speech, which I'm not sure it's a speech as much as a rambling. Hal Terrio has something that I brought over today that I'm going to ask him to play a tune on in about 20 minutes maybe or so. But also what you have along this side of the we're not in the church, right? Most of the things along on that table came from New France, or they were my grandfather's. I'm not Paul Stehelin, the guy that wrote the book. That's my father. So have a look at those things, and if any of them raise any interest, or if you have similar things or stories about similar things, I'd be just delighted to hear them, because I grew up with a lot of those things, and so I sort of grew up with the stories about what they are and where they came from and what they mean. I've got to get my words now, otherwise I'll get totally out of control. So this summer, Hal and Sonny Barr, Rod LaFleur, and Stacy came back to Long Tuscan Lake, where Ann and I have a cottage. And Long Tuscan Lake, for those of you that don't know where it is, it's the headwaters of the Silver River. So from it, you go down into Little Tuscan, and that's where New France was at the end of Little Tuscan. So it's between Langford Lake, Little Tuscan, and Long Tuscan's the headwater. All of that headwater basically now belongs to the Nature Conservancy. Going down the Silver River, most of it now belongs to the province, including the site where New France was. So these fine gentlemen showed up on the brand at about 10 o'clock, and we chatted about what they were trying to do and decided that if we were going to have any say or impact into what happened with New France, that we really had to garner some interest in the whole thing. And as a vehicle for that, we would use the Weymouth waterfront folks to help us pull together a lot of names to be able to go to the province and the Nature Conservancy and say, we have to have some input into this process. I think at the end of the day, had my father lived, his view of New France was always that it should become a park. It should become somewhere where people could go and enjoy themselves. So, that being said, we decided to try to put something on. I don't think any of us thought that this many people would show up, quite frankly. But there you have it. We also, at that time, I said, as Ann, my wife, will tell you, I'm if nothing, not a hoarder, that I would provide some stuff. So some of the stuff that I have is there. There's only a couple of things I'd like to put in context for you because they become part of the story. Could you just bring over the stuff that's on the little, yeah, just that stuff. I'd just like to explain a few things to you about the stuff that's there. And because I find them particularly interesting. There's not just stuff there from New France.
what happened after New France ceased basically in 1912 was it just sat dormant effectively until almost 1945, 46, 47, when Mersey Paper Company burnt everything down, except the office. So they destroyed the whole settlement. But what had happened in the meantime was Americans had come here and they built camps along Tuscan Lake. So they built 3 camps. One was at the top of the lake. The oldest camp was called Bears Tooth. The next oldest camp was called Log Cabin. And then there was a camp at the top. All of these people were from New York, and they would come up and spend the whole summer. There was also a camp at the end of Long Tuscan called Hemlock Lodge, which was built by my grandfather from wood that he basically expropriated from New France, because I think he probably thought it was his anyway. So those camps became part of Southfield and Riverdale. And there were 2 people in particular. One was Dennis Bright, and one was Ben Hatfield, who lived in Riverdale and Southfield. Part of what you got there is a set of chess men carved by Dennis Bright. And Dennis Bright was a guy back in the woods forever, and he tended to gate. Many of you may not remember there was a gate you had to go through to get back to New France. So one of the things you have over there is very special to me because it was carved by a man who couldn't read or write, but he could do incredible things with wood, and he was a craftsman. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I'll put these back, is my grandfather's passport. Now the reason I brought this is because many of you in this room will not believe the story I'm going to tell you, and I can prove it's true because I have the passport that proves that it's true. And you'll get the gist of that when I tell you the story. This is just interesting. That was one of my grandfather's helmets. It's from the First World War. And what's interesting to me about this is they actually went and fought with as little protection as this helmet gave them, which is basically none. It's tin can, is really what it is. So we got the passport, we got the helmet, we got Dennis's chessmen. The other thing that's over there is this little box, brass box. These brass boxes were given to all the soldiers who were serving in, for want of a better word, the British Army at Christmas 1914. So every soldier got one of these. They issued about 350,000 of them. Most of them never survived, I would guess. But in them were 2 things, depending on whether you were a smoker or otherwise. If you were a smoker, you got a tobacco pipe and a whole bunch of good things. If you didn't smoke, you got a pen and paper value system, I guess. The other thing is this little red thing. And this is a wallet that comes from Morocco. And again, you'll see, I only bring this to verify the little story I'm going to tell you tonight. So let me get rid of those. Stop. Okay, I'm just going to move this a little bit. So, what's page 1? This is going to be long, right? A lot of you have probably read The Electric City, which was the book my father wrote. And to put it in context, he wrote that book, well, it's got to be 30 years ago now. But the book basically stops in 1910. Because they left New France, just basically walked out, closed the doors, and moved to Weymouth, and or some of them have gone off to do other things. So the family is this little diagram here. So at the top, you've got the old guy, and he was born in Alsace in 1837. So at that time, Alsace was part of France, and it fell to the Germans in the War of 1872, and it became part of Germany. And when that happened, he left, because he was French and they were German, and they weren't going to meet anywhere in between. He was married to a Buisson, who was born in France. So the old guy died here in Weymouth, August the 8th, actually it's the 7th, no, it was August the 8th, 1918. So he never saw the end of the First War. He had fought in the War of 1872, and he had, at that point, 6 sons serving in overseas, 5 with the French Army and 1 with the Canadian Army. So that little flag down there, if you look at it, it has 6 maple leafs on it. And they used to fly that flag for the boys who were serving overseas. So if you had 2 sons overseas, your flag had 2 maple leafs on it. So, he came over here. The oldest guy, what's really interesting if you look at this, and I'll just give you when they were born, without giving you the names. 1870, 1871, 1872, 1873, 1874. He was a busy man. And it goes on. There's one period there where I think it's 2 years between them. Okay? So, my grandfather is the one on the left, Emile Jean. He was the oldest. So he was born in 1870, before they left Alsace. And he did his military service, and this will become relevant later in the story, in the French Army in 1890, because everybody had to serve for 1 year, every male, able-bodied male, had to serve for 1 year in the French Army, and then they went on a reserve list. So that's my grandfather. The next old, these are sort of in age chronology, right? Oldest to youngest. The youngest male was Morris, and he never served in the French Army. So he never got called up because he came to Canada before he would have been called up in France. So you had Emile, Jean-Jacques, Charles, Therese, Adeline, Sophie. Adeline didn't live very long. Louis, Roger, Paul, Germaine, Maurice, Simon, and Marie Bernard. So that was the family that came here. But if you actually think about it, he was born in 1837, and he came here in 1893. So he was no spring chicken when he came here. And my grandfather was also no spring chicken when he came here. And they left everything in France, and they came here. Why would they do that? And I'm giving you a little bit of background before we go to what happened. France was a mess. They were living outside of Paris. The boys were not being well behaved. It was not a good place to be. So the old guy had been served in the War of 1872 with Father Blanche, who was the guy who started the college at St. Anne's. They were great buddies. And he said to my great-grandfather, get your kids out of there, come on over here. There's lots of land, there's lots of opportunity. So they came. So the first one that came was Jean-Jacques, because Emile was just coming off his military duty, so he couldn't come at that point. He had to come later. So Jean-Jacques is the first one. So if you've read the book, he's the one that came over and found the sites and started to buy land. So those are the players. I only ever knew Germaine, Maurice, Simon, and that's it. The rest of them I never met. My grandfather died in 1943, although I look old, I'm not that old. And the rest of them were either dead or I was too young to ever meet them because they were living in France. So, those are the players. When I tried to put something together that people might be interested in, the most information I had was about my grandfather. Okay? I have information about others as to what they did, but not in the same amount of detail. So Jean-Jacques, he basically stayed in North America. Charlie went back to France eventually. Therese went back to France. Simon Adeline died early on. Louis went back to France eventually. Roger ended up back in France. Paul stayed here a long time. Paul stayed until he came back after the First War, and he stayed until about 1926 before he went back to France. Germaine had got married here in Weymouth in 1900. And if you look at the Electric City book, the picture of the marriage people in the Woodland Hotel down here, that's Germaine's wedding. So she was 21 years old, and she married a sea captain, but he was quite a bit older than her. So she had already left by the time 1910 came along, as had Roger. Morris was the young hellion of the family. He was the youngest boy, so he got away with everything. He went back to France he went to France for the First War, I'll come to that in a minute, but he stayed in France until 1954, and then he came for a visit. I lived in Halifax at the time, and he came to visit us in 1954, and he died at Church Point in 1959. The only thing I can tell you about Mo is there are many people along the shore that would recognize Mo if he were to walk in here today, if they were still alive. He became a legend along the shore. So he died here. Simone stayed here for a long time. She lived in Weymouth, and she finally went back to France about 1932, and she lived in Paris for the rest of her life. And she died in Paris. And Marie Bernard, she had died early on too. So those are the people. What I'm going to talk about tonight is Emile. He left New France in 1910 because there were only three children born in New France. There was Bernadette, there was Jacqueline, and there was Emile Mitt. For those of you who are from the shore, you'll recognize this. The oldest son is always named after the father, and you just keep going down the pecking order. So, I'm named after my father, and he was named after Paul. Okay? So, they moved to Church Point in 1910. That was before New France had shut down. Bernadette and Jacqueline went to school, but the real reason they moved was so the boys, quote unquote, and Anne will comment on this if given the chance. It was really important that the boys got an education. So they moved to Church Point because they had college, St. Anne's College was there, and the boys could go to school. So my father, the one who wrote the book, he's born in 1910 in Church Point. So after Emile, there are no other children born in the woods. So we're now, they're living happily in Church Point, and lo and behold, 1914 comes along, August, and we have the First War, right? And so, going backwards in the little story, if you were French, it didn't matter where you lived. You were still liable to serve in the French Army, period. That's it. You could be living in the States, Canada, didn't matter. If you were on the reserve list, it was automatic. You had to go back. If you couldn't join the Canadian Army, because you'd be court-martialed by the French Army, and if you had never done your service, but you were over 18, you had to go back. Even though you would become a Canadian citizen or whatever. That was it. Okay? So, they got their call in August of 1914. The French didn't waste any time, because everything in the First War was about how quickly you could get the troops to the front, because that was the game. So the 5 boys, that was Charlie, Paul, Bernard, Roger, and Morris, left for France on August the 11th on a ship called the Santa Ana. Now, somebody with technical skills, I've got a little slide here. It's amazing what you can find on the internet if you have a starting point. This is the Santa Ana. When it sailed on, guess what date? You're going to come across a lot of dates here in August, and August the 8th. I don't know why. I was born on August the 8th, 1948. Go figure. This is the shipload of the French reservists who went on the Santa Ana on August the 8th, 1914, back to France. Okay? And they came all from all over North America. They were Americans, Canadians, whatever. Somewhere in that picture could be any of those 5 boys. I mean, it's incredible you can actually go and find that without very much difficulty. So off they went. Who was not there was my grandfather, Emil. Why wasn't he there? He'd been busy too. He had 7 children. So the French, in spite of everything else, if you had more than 5 children, you were okay for now. So he didn't have to go. So there should have really been 6 of them. Thus the maple leaves, I'll come to that in a minute. But there were only 5 potential ones that went back, and they all went into the French army. So my grandfather was left behind here. He putzed around in the woods for a while, but you know, it was the war and he wanted to go. In 1916, he got a notice from the French army that said, in spite of the 7 kids, it's time to go. So he trundles off to Yarmouth, says, here I am, what do you want me to do? Because he had been commissioned in the French army. He held a commission of lieutenant in the French army. And they said, oh, sorry, mistake. Didn't mean it, you go home. But they also said to him, you can join the Canadian army. So I find this hard to understand, but maybe it's just because I'm not of that generation, but he's got 7 kids at home, and he says, okay, I'm good. He goes and joins the Canadian army. So he joins the Canadian Army in 1916. And he's commissioned as a major in the infantry. Goes to infantry school in Halifax. And he ends up in a thing called the 165th Battalion d'Outre-mer. And this was a battalion that was raised primarily in New Brunswick, but with significant numbers from this area, from southwest Nova. Somewhere. So this is the 165th Battalion. There were 6 officers, of which one is my grandfather. But there were about 650 men. It was a little bit shy of a true battalion, but you know, I guess they were having problems. But the names, and if any of you have an interest at some point, the names are, I think I actually figured this out. There were 24 officers, 658 men. Of this total, 54 were from Southwest Nova. A lot of them must have been related. For example, Amiro, Desiree Amiro, Joseph Amiro, Charles Amiro, Adelph Amiro. Okay, they were from Plimpton, West Pimlico, Matagan, Wedgeport, Littlebrook, Yarmouth, Bellows Cove, Rosecock, Weymouth. But they were primarily Francophones because that entire battalion was primarily French. So these 650 guys and 24 officers, off they set for the brave new world. It took them a while to get organized. They didn't actually leave until March 28, 1917. So they sailed from Halifax, and I think we got a picture of this one. So this is the ship they leave on to go to Halifax in 1917. I've made another note. 25 of those 54 people, those soldiers, were from Matega. So there must have been a lot of brothers and cousins, and God knows how many never came back. To quote from the history of the 165th, they embarked at 6 p.m., they went to Halifax Basin, they left on the 28th, and they had basically a 10-day crossing to get to England. Totally uneventful. No submarines, no bad guys. Good trip. They got off in Liverpool, and they went to Sussex. Now, what then happened was this battalion got broken up. Now, what I want to show you before I change momentum here is, can we find the one with the... Okay, I want you to look at that and put it in your mind. That's the cap badge of the 165th Battalion. Okay? But what I want you to pay a special attention to is the star in the middle. This one right here. And I'm not making the rest of the story up, believe me. So, that was the 165th Battalion. What happened when it got to England? It got broken up. But most of the men went into what was called the Canadian Forestry Corps, which were a group that was formed because they had knowledge of forestry and lumber mills and all of that. Well, that was my grandfather. That's what he did in New France. So he basically ran the woodlands operations. And that forestry corps then went to France, and it cut down forests in France and turned them into timber and shoring for trenches and God knows what. So, the battalion sort of disintegrated a little bit, and it went into various components of the Canadian Army. So my grandfather, for the duration, up until 1918, was a company commander of the 39th Company of the Forestry Corps. Now, he gets wounded in August of 1918. And he's sent to a hospital. And this is where it becomes a story that, anyway. The Moroccan administration, Morocco at the time, 1918, was French. It was France. It was part of France. They send out a message to the British Army, Canadian Army, saying, we'd like to get a forester to go to Morocco and go to the Atlas Mountains and cruise the mountains and come up with a plan and help us harvest the forests of Morocco. So who puts up his hand? My grandfather. 7 kids, been away for almost 2 years, wounded. I'll go. You know, I never met him, but anyway. So he puts up his hand and says, yep, I'll go. He applies and they accept it. He doesn't get out of hospital until December 1918. Okay, so he was not in good shape. He goes to London to get his orders to go to Morocco. And I can prove he did that because I have the passport. The passport was actually issued in London. He paid all of 6pence for the passport. He gets a big stamp and a picture on it if you look at it. And he's given orders to go to Morocco. I'm going to mention one part of his orders. I was given, these are his words, I was given strict instructions to stay away from the front of military operations. Okay. There's a sidebar here, and I put this in for a bunch of reasons, which I won't bore you with, but he gets his orders and goes back to France. He gets on a ship, which is carrying French troops to fight the bad guys, the Berbers, who were in an uprising in Morocco, guess where? In the Atlas Mountains. So he gets on the ship with these French troops to go to Morocco. We don't, if you read a lot of history, which my wife will tell you I do, and bores her to death, but you don't hear much about women in the First World War, right? I mean, there might have been some mention of them. But again, a lot of this story comes from a paper my grandfather wrote. He actually wrote 80 pages of the story of Morocco. So he gets on the ship and he says, I was surprised to find aboard one of my cousins, Suzanne Picard, a Red Cross worker, who was going to Rabat. So he was headed for Rabat, which was the capital at that time of Morocco, still is, to take charge of a dispensary for women. She had spent the whole of World War I as a Red Cross worker at the front, both English and French. She wore the Legion of Honor, Military Medal, Croix de Guerre, Victoria Cross Nursing Star, etc. And here she was, just coming out of the First War, going to Morocco, which was in the state of rebellion. So he gets to Casablanca. The ship lands in Casablanca, he gets off, and he's told to go up country, I guess we would say. But it's interesting to me because, again, if you read the book that my father wrote, I mean, the parts that get kind of, they were great romantics. And he obviously got it from his father. I'm not that romantic, but he describes the train trip from Casablanca to Rabat, which is, I thought was, he was raised in French, and here he is sort of describing this countryside. The line from Casablanca to Rabat followed the Atlantic coast across fields of corn and rye. Immense plains were grazed flocks of sheep and goats, guarded by Arab horsemen. There are some comments in this document he wrote that would be very political today. But the one thing, as you read a lot of what he wrote, they live their life, we live our life, and everything's fine. Nobody's going to change anybody. So he's going along, and he gets to Rabat. But instead of going and living in the officer's mess in Rabat, he decides he wants to go live in town. So he goes and gets a room in the middle of Rabat. So you got to remember, this is 1919. Rabat was probably not a real warm, fuzzy place to be if you were a white Anglo-Saxon whatever. Okay, it was probably not a good place to decide to go and live. But he goes to the center of town and gets a room. He then goes and sees this Marshal Laity. So we've got a picture of this guy. No, that's the ship here. This guy. And the only reason I'm telling you this is because there are some comments in the document that if you've ever been in the military, or if you have any sense of military history, are really quite fascinating. So he goes to see this guy. And again, it's amazing how small the world is. So the station guard came up and paid his respects, and the officer of the day came to salute me and to take my card. As I had been announced, he took me up a big staircase leading to the second floor to the apartment of the marshal. So this guy's in charge of Morocco. This staircase of white marble is decorated on both sides by trophies of Arab weapons, green pennons surmounted by the crescent, and ornamented by long horsetails, testimony to the conquest over the Berbers. They were, they owned the country, right? The marshal received me in his office. He was wearing undress uniform of horizon blue, and as he was recovering from a fall from horseback, walked on crutches. After saluting me, he said, "What does the English uniform mean? You are French." I must tell you that I was not unknown to the marshal. It seemed like he knew everybody. My father is connected him by marriage with one of my cousins. I explained what I was doing here. And then this is the part that I found interesting. I shall not describe the role of Marshal Laity at Morocco during the war. Without him, without his audacity, without his qualities as an organizer and as a soldier, Morocco would have been lost to France. He was able to hold it for his country with only a handful of old soldiers and Foreign Legion. My grandfather had a great love of the Foreign Legion, which was passed on me, even though I'd never been it, by my father. I mean, I got the castle and the Foreign Legion soldiers and all that stuff. So he now has got to go up to the Atlas Mountains. So I think so this is Morocco, basically. So he's setting up in Rabat, which is up here. And he's got to go over here. Right? So he's got to go to a place called Fort El Hajeb. Fort El Hajeb today is a town of 20,000 people. At the time, it was an outpost of the Foreign Legion. Okay? So off he sets on horseback to go there. It's at this point that we go back to the 165th, because he's still, in his mind, part of the 165th Battalion. They stop, and they decide to take a shortcut. So they could take two roads, apparently. They're on horseback. There's two of them. A guide and himself. And they decide to take a shortcut. So, they stop for lunch. Rest of the time on the grass while the horses grazed on the hay. They were so fond of it. Around 2 o'clock, we were getting ready to remount when suddenly we were surrounded by a band of Berber horsemen. These are the bad guys. Who, silent as shadows, had taken us by surprise. Rapidly, my guide said to me, "Take your revolver. If you are a Christian, say your act of contrition, for we are scuppered." The word scupper is a thing on a ship where the water runs off the deck through a hole in the side. So scupper means, like, we're done. We're cooked. This is not good. Speak to them and tell them that I'm a Canadian who wants to visit their forest. I'm just here to look at your woods. Okay. The chief, a fine old man with a white beard, looked me over fixedly and head to foot, staring especially at my helmet, on which shone the star of the 165th. So he's got this badge on his hat with a star in the middle. So this interpreter tells him that. The Arab bent his head. The old chief listened. His hard eyes became more human. He said to my guide, "We know that the Canadians are brave men." This is kind of hard to believe stuff, but welcome to our forest. This is the chief Berber guy. "Welcome to our forest, O Canadian chief. You and your friend will be sacred to us." So his guide said, "Let's get out of here. Let's go quickly before they change their minds." "Not at all," I replied. This is my grandfather. "They must believe that we have absolutely no fear." And taking a box of cigarettes from my saddlebag, a farewell present from the Captain Dunbar, I passed to the fine horsemen who surrounded us, now with friendly smiles. Then, throwing the bridle of my horse to one of the Berber horsemen, I took the arm of the chief and walked for several minutes. Before leaving, he said to me, "You are my father, my tribe is your tribe," and he invited me to visit him. Okay. So his guide says, "We've had a wonderful escape. Let's get the hell out of here." And, "My dear friend," I replied, "I'm going to tell you a little story. The other day at Rabat, I was drinking coffee in an Arab shop, when to my surprise, I saw two magnificent Berbers coming to bow before me after they had seen the star on my helmet. They told me that this star is the Sharif star of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And you saw that the old chief also had a great respect for it. But I confess that I thought for a moment I would never see Canada again. It's an interesting story only because it connects to a whole bunch of different cultures that there should be no connection to, right? And one of the things that people have said about New France after they've read the book is you had a whole bunch of people living in New France. You had the Mechanec, you had the French, you had the English, and they all lived and worked in New France together. And I can sort of sense, having read this document, how some of that progress went off on my grandfather and why it was the way it was. So he gets to this place called Anne-Lee. I mean, he's supposed to be out there looking at the woods, right? So Anne-Lee had 4,000 French soldiers fighting, guess who were the girls, the bad guys, the Berbers, in the Atlas Mountains. So he starts to do his work. And his work becomes increasingly more difficult because these Berber guys keep attacking them, surrounding them, running at them, and shooting at them. And finally, the guy in charge of the Foreign Legion in this fort says, no, you can't go out there anymore. You can't go to the mountains anymore to look at the trees. It's too dangerous. So this fellow that is in charge is a guy called Colonel Oct. The only reason I raise this again is it was such a different time. It's hard for us to comprehend it. But Colonel Oct had fought at Verdun. And for those of you who may have an interest in the First War, Verdun was the bloodbath of the French army. So there were 275,000 men killed at Verdun in about 8 months. Okay? And this guy that was in charge of the Foreign Legion, he had been one of the officers there, and they had lost 6,500 officers, killed, dead. So he's in charge of this camp, and they decide that he can't keep doing his work in the woods. But he says, why don't you come along with me while I go and resupply. The way the Foreign Legion was operating was they had one big fort, and then they have all these little outposts. So it was sort of shades of Vietnam. It was kind of bizarre because they would go resupply them. But the men who went out there went for a year. And they had no relief, they had nothing, they just went to these outposts and there they were. So Oct says to him, come along with me, you can come with me for one of these resupply missions, which should only take a week or two if all goes well. So off they go. So by this time, he's been there probably about a month and a half in Morocco. It's interesting to me what the resupply convoy consisted of. So I'm just going to find that part for you. Oh, before I get there, he describes something else that I found fascinating. He describes the market day in this outpost, in this Foreign Legion outpost. At certain times, the village fills up with strangers who come from the four corners of the mountains. This is market day. In the village square, all kinds of wonderful things are heaped up. You can buy an endless variety of things. Gilded Turkish slippers, arms, from the poignant with a curved blade to Maluka's old rifles, encrusted with silver, curved sabers whose blades are as sharp as a razor, silk robes, iridescent colors, carpets, jewels. Only the last article is not sold openly on account of the French who forbid this traffic. However, and that last article is women. However, in the midst of varicolored baskets, camels, donkeys, and goats, you can see the daughters of the Sahara, black as night, crouched, silent, and passive. I guess, some things don't change. In the middle of this, the Berbers walk impassively under their white burnouses, appearing to see nothing, yet observing the slightest detail. So off he goes now to this resupply thing. And the resupply column is made up of, sort of 1,000 men, 2 battalions of Zouaves. And Zouaves were blacks from Africa who fought for the French army in the First War. A battalion of legionnaires, some some horsemen, 2 battalions of artillery, an airplane, 55 Arabs, a company of Thabor infantry, and 20 dancing girls. So off they set to resupply this thing. He ends up resupplying the first, but the other part that was interesting is he describes the food they ate. And again, it's interesting to me because of just what it was they were eating. My relations with the officers of the different regiments were always very cordial. Every evening on the march, I was invited to dine at the different officers' mess. The first evening on the road sent me an invitation on behalf of the Legion. You'll be surprised, he told me, as a matter of fact, after an excellent meal washed down with champagne, a meal which made me forget that I was in the desert, and scorched all day, they brought for dessert ice cream. He said, I couldn't believe my eyes, I didn't know how they did it. But the other things that they ate were roast gazelle, wild boar, partridges, rabbit, asparagus, wild artichokes, fresh figs, bitter orange, pomegranates, and grasshopper legs fried in butter. Grasshopper's legs closely resembled frog's legs and reminded me of St. John the Baptist in the desert. So, anyway, he carries on with this resupply trip, and it ends with this battle. Now here he is, he's supposed to be there. He's not supposed to go anywhere near where there's fighting. He's just supposed to go and look at the woods. And he ends up in this battle. And I can't visualize it. I think one of the pictures that we have somewhere, I don't know if it's on there or not, but what you have on the table over here is you have a set of spurs somewhere down there. And those were his spurs. So those were what he was wearing when he was in Morocco. It's the only thing I have that I know for sure, except the wallet came and went, or was from Morocco. So, I won't bore you with all of this because it's, he's told not to go near the action. And he says, no, I'm going to go anyway if it's okay, if you don't mind. And here's how he describes the battle. It's forward at the front was the next command. Just then the Berbers sprang into view 800 meters ahead of us. They were coming swiftly towards us and shooting as they came, but they were not doing us any damage. We knew their tactics to swing in a half circle, shooting as they rolled, repeating the maneuver again and again. As for us, after the first volley, we waited no longer, and St. Martin raised himself in his stirrups, lifted his saber, and cried, "Charge at the gallop, march," which meant the horses started to go faster and faster. Unleashed fury to the Sappahs, who were almost all Arabs. It was Oran, and so the Sappahs started to charge with them. And anyway, they go into this thing, and he's there riding with them into this thing. Miraculously, he comes out of it. The Arabs flee, and they resupply the fort. So, that takes you to June of 1919. Gets on a boat and comes back to Church Point. And he arrived in Church Point around the end of June 1919 from Morocco. He went from Morocco back to France, England, back here. His father, slide one, had died in 1918. And as he was the oldest son, it was up to him to clean up the estate. So when he came back in June of 1919, the old guy had died August the 8th. He's got to clean up the estate, which is really New France at that point, and some holdings in France itself. Eventually, he gets the thing organized, and New France was sold in 1923. And it had literally been sitting there since 1910, just empty. Nothing had happened. They'd gone back and cut some areas of forest, but the mill wasn't operating. They were bringing the wood out. So he sells it all. And it was sold to a company from St. John, New Brunswick. And in accordance with the French estate, everything was split equally among all the surviving children. So there was no British system where the oldest son got the property or the bulk of it. So each one of the kids that was still alive got their share of the estate, which was rather substantial then. So we're talking 1923, they each got about $125,000, which in 1923 was a lot of money. And what then happened was all of the five brothers who'd gone back to the French army, they all stayed in France except Paul. He came back in 1919 and he tried to revive New France, but he couldn't get the children to agree. And the girls didn't want any part of it, and he didn't have enough money to buy it. So, and the estate had to be split equally among all the children. So it got sold, and everybody got their share of the cash. Some of them lived on that for the rest of their lives and never worked again. Others, my grandfather, he lost all of his money in the crash. So in 1929, that was it. Everything was gone. And he had been working in the woods since he came home, trying to, make money in the lumber business. But when the crash came, not only did the lumber business die, but he lost most of what he had in that crash. And if you want to, there's, in the back of the Electric City, my father wrote it far better than I can say it. He wrote a little byline of each of these people, what happened to them. But if you think about what he had gone through, and where he'd been, and what he'd done, to wake up in 1930 with nothing, it must have been pretty devastating. So he stayed in Church Point, and during the 30s, he was the postmaster in Church Point. And by that time, all of the children were gone, except my grandfather had, there was Bernadette, she had died, she died in the 30s. There was Jacqueline, she went and became a nun. She went into a cloister in 1932. She came out in 1946 and went to run an orphanage in Japan. Must have been traumatic. But, my father had gone to law school and he was living in Yarmouth. And so he basically only had the two youngest twins, who were girls, who were at home. And, I think if you read between the lines and read some of the letters, he was, he was it was a bad last 10 years of his life. And then along comes the Second World War. Now some of the things you have down here, one in particular, if you'd like to take the time, there's a picture down there. That one was being held up now.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to give you the perspective of that, like I said at the beginning, some of this is out of joint. It's because it's hard to keep it all together based on the relics. But that's a picture of C Company of the West Nova Scotia Regiment in England in 1942. Okay? And in that picture, most of the people in that picture came from anywhere between Annapolis Royal and Yarmouth. And a huge chunk of the people in that picture, I know that because my father told me, because he served with them, came from Riverdale, Southville, Weymouth, Matagan, all along the shore. I don't have a clue who's in that picture except my father, who was the commander of the company at the time when they were in England. So, to bring full circle to a mill, if any of you can look at that picture and say, that person in the third row is Billy Bob from Riverdale, just write it down on a piece of paper. Because I'd love to know. I'm sure there's at least 4 or 5 Cromwells in there. I'm sure there's a couple of Brights. I'm sure there's Wallansons, because they all came from here. So, the 30s, my grandfather's lost everything. The rest of the boys have gone back to France, along with the girls, okay? And he's here all alone. My father's a lawyer in Yarmouth. His oldest son is out west, teaching school. One's in a cloister. You can't even go see her. And he's probably not a happy guy. He dies on December the 23rd, I think it is, 20th, 1943. And again, there's a certain romanticism in the family. He didn't see his father before he died. My father was in Italy in December 43, because they landed in July, and he didn't see his father. So he went overseas in 39, and my grandfather died in 43. So the rest of the boys, I can tell you about some of them, still trying to put pieces together, but it's a continuing saga. Roger had become a sea captain, as I mentioned earlier, and he sailed for the Hawaiian line out of New York. He went back in the First War. The 4 boys who went back for the First War, one of them ended up, Morris, the youngest one. He ended up at the French consulate in New York, trying to recruit soldiers for the French army from 1915 to 1918. Roger was seconded to the 1st Division of the Canadian Army in the First War as an interpreter, because they all spoke English and French fluent. Okay, and so the boys that had gone into the French army initially, they ended up being seconded to the Canadian army. One of them was a foo, which means a forward observer. So he was the guy that went out in the trenches and called the artillery out of his position and said, blow me away. And that was, that was Louis. And if you actually go into the records of the Digby Courier, there's a letter from Louis back to his friend in Weymouth in 1915, 16, I think it is, basically describing the war, what it was like. And it's just interesting reading because it gives you a different perspective on it. Roger, I don't know if he ever went back to sea or not after the war. I do know that he married a rich lady in France and ended up somewhere in the south of France at the end of his life. Germaine, her husband was 20 years older than she was when they were married here in Weymouth. She got shipwrecked 2 years after they were married, and they sailed in an open boat for 1,400 miles. Believe it or not, 8 crew members and her husband and her. She used to, I knew her quite well. She used to describe the story. They would take turns with a pistol. Her husband would sleep and she'd hold the pistol and stare. She'd sleep. They sailed 1,400 miles to Argentina in this little lifeboat. So she ended up staying in New York. Eventually, she moved to Ottawa, and she died in Ottawa. So my father got her reorganized in Ottawa. Morris, as I said, came for a short visit that lasted, whatever it was, 6 years. And he died in Halifax in Camp Hill. But after the First World War, he went back to France and he got involved in racehorses. He loved horses. And he married in France and had a couple of kids. But interestingly, during the Second World War, he was in the resistance because Gisors, which is where the family house is, that big house in the book, that's right on the outskirts of Paris. It's just on the edge of Normandy. And so he was instrumental in getting the pilots down through the Pyrenees into Spain. And so he was in the resistance for the whole war. And then he came to Canada and died. Simone stayed in Paris her whole life. Jean-Jacques, and I can't remember which one it is, Jean-Jacques or Louis ended up in Hampton, New Brunswick, and died in Hampton. He never worked again. He managed to keep his money. And Jean-Jacques ended up in the States and finally ended up, I think, in California. And he went into the furniture business. He was making furniture, so good furniture. So that's what takes you to what happened to those folks. The only thing I'm going to add before I close, and I'm glad to answer any questions or fill in any blanks. Some of the stuff you have at the back is my father's stuff, and he was a worse hoarder than I am. And the only reason a lot of the papers survived that we have are because he was the executor on virtually all of the wills of all of those people. And even though there was some that were in France, because he was the only lawyer. So after the war, as the uncles and the aunts started to die off, he had spent enough time in France after the war that, and he knew them when he was a child, right? Because he had met them in the 20s. He started to gather up all of these documents. So a lot of the information we have is just because he was a hoarder. You know, he'd sell the assets, not that there were many in most cases, but he kept all the papers. He kept all the documents. And so a lot of the things you have here are because of my father. You know, he had this great love of history and love of New France because it was something, he grew up with all the legends, but he was never part of it. You know, he loved it, and he kept coming back to it. I was born on August 8, 1948. First time I went to New France was in September 1948. I've never not been to New France in a year of my life. Sometimes it was only for 2 or 3 days. Sometimes it was for 3 weeks. But all that to say, none of this would be here, none of this would be here if they didn't keep papers and write things down. So if any of you have a story or a legend or send it to, or at least write it down and give it to somebody, because that's the only way that history is going to be kept, right? And on that, my conclusion was, and as Anne will attest, I didn't say a lot of things in here that I probably shouldn't have said anyway. My conclusion was to be continued. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to gather information on people that I don't have a lot of information on. And other people who participated in New France and the period of time from 1914 to 1945. Because, you know, if we don't get that information now, most of us aren't going to be here to share it in 25 years. So with that, if you've got any questions or what anything is there or what I said or what, anything else, glad to try to answer. And the story is true of what went on.